My racist neighbor was planning something horrifying. Then he vanished. I always thought my neighborhood was quiet and friendly, the kind where people waved at each other while walking their dogs and borrowed sugar from their neighbors. Everything seemed normal, which is probably why I never noticed that something felt off about Mr. Green. He wasn't rude, but he kept to himself. He never joined community events, never had visitors, and barely spoke to anyone. I assumed he was just a private person, the kind who preferred solitude over small talk. That was until one particular night when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. It was late, and I was outside in my backyard enjoying the cool air when I heard voices drifting over from Mr. Green's house. It caught my attention immediately. He never had company, but what made me freeze was the tone of the conversation. The voices were low and harsh, carrying a tense, almost conspiratorial energy. They weren't just chatting, they were whispering with purpose, as if they didn't want to be overheard. At first I wasn't really listening, but then certain words started to stand out. They were talking about the neighborhood, about how it had changed. The new families that had moved in over the past year, the ones who didn't look like the longtime residents, were apparently a problem to them. Their presence was ruining everything, making it unsafe. It was the way they spoke, the anger laced in their words that sent a chill down my spine. Then the conversation took a darker turn. They weren't just complaining, they were planning something. They talked about handling it quietly, about ways to make things right again. That was when I realized this wasn't just casual racism. This was something more dangerous. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I didn't know what I would do with it, but I knew I needed proof. The voices continued for a few more minutes before everything fell silent. I stayed outside a little longer, my mind racing, then went inside and listened to the recording again. The weight of what I had just heard settled in. I had proof that something was about to happen. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something much bigger than I had realized. I started digging, looking into Mr. Green and the other man he had been speaking with. What I found was unsettling. Mr. Green had a history, one that involved quietly moving from town to town every few years, leaving no real trace behind. And the other man didn't even live in our neighborhood. That meant he had come here for a reason. I knew I had to do something, so I anonymously sent the recording to a few people, community leaders, local authorities, hoping someone would take action. But I also needed to confront Mr. Green myself. When I knocked on his door later that evening, I could tell the moment he opened it that he already knew. There was no surprise in his expression, just recognition. He didn't ask why I was there, didn't even seem bothered by it. He simply looked at me as if he was waiting to see what I would do next. I told him I knew what he had been planning, and that others knew now too. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down your spine. He told me I thought I had stopped something, but I didn't understand. This wasn't new, and it wouldn't stop just because I had overheard one conversation. Then he shut the door in my face. The next morning, he was gone. No one saw him leave, and there was no sign of where he had gone. His house sat empty, as if he had never really been there at all. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other strange things. Certain cars that used to pass by at odd hours disappeared. The tension that had been hovering over the neighborhood seemed to ease. And most importantly, the families who had once been treated like outsiders were now being welcomed. It was as if people had woken up to what had been happening in their own backyard, realizing that silence was just another form of complicity. But even now, I still wonder. If I hadn't been outside that night, if I hadn't overheard that conversation, what would have happened? And more than anything, I wonder where Mr. Green went, because something tells me he didn't go far.